The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. And in Galilee these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had also come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. And when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. And when they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. And afterward Jesus appeared in a different form to many of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. May God bless to our understanding and hence to our daily living the message found in these passages. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I've entitled the sermon today, Mary Magdalene, Caregiver and First Witness. Those who do not matter are usually ignored. Both their bodies and circumstances are of no consequence. I recall the story of an Afrikaner physician walking through a waiting room filled with black Africans and saying, "What? Nobody here yet?" The African bodies did not matter. And the U.S. Constitution valued a black man as 3/5 of a white man for voting purposes. And women are not even mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. In fact, throughout the ages, women have never mattered anywhere on the planet. And even when women inherited the monarchy, they ruled as if they were kings. The subject of today's sermon is Mary Magdalene, a woman of some wealth who followed Jesus and cared for his needs. She is mentioned 12 times in the Gospels, more than any other man or woman. She was a witness to the crucifixion while all the male disciples ran away. She was the first to discover the empty tomb and the first person to whom Jesus, the risen Jesus, spoke. In fact, she was commissioned by the angel at the tomb to go and tell the others the good news. Yet the Christian tradition has not given her her fair share of recognition. Since institutions in patriarchal societies are founded only by men and never by women, the disciple Peter was declared the founder of the church by Jesus himself, when, after Jesus after Peter acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church." And the Christian church views him as the founder. Clearly, the Western Christian tradition has not been kind to Mary Magdalene. Because Jesus reportedly cast 7 demons out of her, she has often been spoken of in the tradition as a prostitute, even though casting out demons was rarely associated with immoral behavior. Rather, in those days, people with psychological problems were thought of as having been possessed by demons, by evil demons and evil spirits, and various other people, particularly priests and so forth, were vested with the powers to cast out those demons. And Jesus did that more than once. Because they viewed her, because the Western tradition viewed her as immoral, several Western artists have portrayed Mary Magdalene either naked or with her body covered with long hair. Most have portrayed her, however, as a beautiful woman with a penitent countenance. Some have identified her as the unnamed woman who washed Jesus' feet with an expensive oil and dried them with her long hair. A few artists have even suggested that a romantic relationship might have existed between Mary Magdalene and Jesus himself. Yet, despite it all, an obviously repentant Mary Magdalene has been revered as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Anglican and the Lutheran churches. And on July 16th, 2022, Pope Francis raised her level of liturgical memory to a feast day, and henceforth she is to be referred to as the Apostle of the Apostles. Clearly, however, neither the canonization of Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary Magdalene has elevated the status of women in societies dominated by those Christian churches. Recently, my colleague and friend, Professor Josiah Young, who teaches at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., published a very perceptive book entitled Black Lives Matter and the Image of God, a theo-anthropological study. Unlike most theologies, however, his theology is discussed in the context of a memoir. His parents were middle-class African Americans in a section of Brooklyn called Bushwick, where he was brought up. It was a place where black lives did not matter, and he attributes his salvation from the evils of the streets to the Methodist Church's youth fellowship, where the church was open every day of the week, providing reading rooms for children to do their homework, a basketball court, and most important, caring adults who nurtured their moral, spiritual, and social development. Professor Young argues that in general, our understanding of God is deeply rooted in the theological imagination of ancient European scholars who had no idea about black people. And thus, understandably, black lives did not matter either to them or to the God they served. Rather, their God necessarily addressed only their needs. And thus the meaning of God's incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth for non-European peoples must be reinterpreted everywhere for each succeeding generation. Otherwise, ancient texts in isolation from their experiences are both meaningless and irrelevant. Yet amazingly, most of us still think about God as an ancient, sovereign king sitting on a throne in a far-away celestial space, overseeing everything throughout the universe and waiting patiently to issue a final judgment at the end of time, a judgment that will determine the eternal destiny of all humans who have ever lived, some being privileged to live with God throughout all eternity, and others suffering the eternal pain of separation and rejection. That continues to be an image that penetrates and pervades our minds. Now, it was the civil rights movement of the 1950s, inspired by the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., that challenged the dictates of white supremacy and forced the issue of equal rights for blacks onto the nation's public agenda and eventually changed our laws. That movement was soon followed by the 20th century version of the feminist movement, then by the indigenous peoples movement, and then by the LGBTQIA plus movement. Prior to the dawn of the feminist movement in the US and elsewhere throughout the world, women were ignored in the public square and certainly not ever treated as equal to men. Similarly, African Americans and indigenous peoples were never viewed as equal to white men. And thus the struggle of LGBTQIA plus peoples for equality remains an uphill battle both in this country and elsewhere. Suffice it to say, however, that the burden is on all of us who are not treated equally and their allies to force their concern onto the public record by using all possible nonviolent means. Once those battles have been engaged, however, there can be and will be no turning back, because they will never again fade away into oblivion. Rather, they will shape the moral awareness of all and inspire them to do all they can to seek their actualization in all the various avenues of life, including our sacred texts, our faith organizations, and the God we worship. All of us who have seen the light must do all we can to let it shine wherever we go. And let me finish this sermon with a personal story that connects slightly with today's subject. As you all know by now, I am the eldest of 10 children. The second child was my sister Mary, whom we all knew affectionately as Bunny. When she was 10 years old, she was stricken with rheumatic fever and consequently was bedridden for 2 years, having to be carried from room to room in our home. And since there were no arrangements in those days for carrying on her schoolwork, when she finally was able to return to school, she was placed in a class with children who were 2 years younger than she. It was miserable for her thereafter. I always felt that she was the most intelligent one in the family, and that setback was horrendous for her, and she disliked school thereafter. I still find it difficult to talk with this subject. Now, there was an institution in our province called the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. It It was founded after the horrific Halifax explosion on December the 6th, 1917, when two ships collided. They were armed with ammunition, collided in the Halifax harbor and destroyed a large section of the city. The northwest side of the city was destroyed, and many children were left homeless, and their parents had died, and fires spread throughout the city. Orphanages at that time did not receive children of color. And eventually, with the urging of the churches, the black churches, the government allocated land outside the city of Halifax and built a facility for approximately 50 black children, most of whom were orphans. One day, our pastor received word that they were in need of a staff person, and his wife, knowing my sister's discomfort with school, mentioned it to my mother. And my sister leapt for joy over the prospect of working there, and eventually she gave the next 20 years of her life to that institution, learning on the job and rising eventually to the position of matron. Alas, the rheumatic fever had taken its toll on various organs of her body, and she was never without pain. And yet her dedication to that institution was phenomenal. She never took vacations, only occasional weekends to visit her family 100 miles away. And on Christmas, which was also her birthday, she always stayed at the home with the children and came to her own home that evening, where we would gather around and she would open her gifts and share the ones that she brought for all of us. Sadly, her death at the age of 37 I'm sorry, it broke our hearts. Yet her memory at the home is precious to this day. And last September, she was honored by a public ceremony that named the road to the home Paris Way. She was the only person I've ever known whose name was Mary Magdalene. I wasn't going to tell all that story because I knew I wasn't sure I'd be able to get through it. But there it is. And there's hopefully the story of Mary Magdalene is not lost in the story of my sister, Mary Magdalene. And now the floor is open for some of your thoughts on this subject. Yes. say something.
Thank you, Peter. And I know that was so hard for you to get through that. I lost a brother who was 39, and I've never gotten over his death in many ways, but I always keep thinking, I wonder what he would be like today, and I'm wondering what your sister would be like today if she was alive today. It was a beautiful story, and she certainly lived up to her Mary Magdalene name, and what she did with her life was an awesome story. Thank you for being willing to share that with us today, Peter. I can remember thinking years and years ago when we did Bible studies that had something to do with Mary Magdalene, and I always wondered if she and Jesus had a relationship, because everything was very spiritual and loving, whatever was talked about in the Bible about them together. Especially the story of where they claim that it was her washing his feet, because that has always been a beautiful story to me. That a woman would use the most expensive oil that she had, and then use her own hair to dry his feet. It was, if there's ever been a romantic story, that certainly would be it. So thank you for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judy.
I just thank you so much, and the way I've heard about your sister before, but not the way you just talked about it was beautiful, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Peter. It is amazing that the point that you made, which is such a simple fact about how many times she's named in the Bible, moreover than anyone else. There's so many different things to think about with that. Like, as the Bible was being put together, the writings were there. It's interesting that there was no way around not putting her into it. You would think, because it was patriarchal, that maybe they were like, maybe we should kind of cut back on the Mary part. But because of how the books were written, where she fell, they simply couldn't, right? But at the same time, as much as that's in there, it's not really brought to our attention in that way. That's all.
So you slipped in at the end of this story, but it's a sense in which it didn't matter. It didn't matter for future generations to really hold her up as a person who gets the church started. When it is recognizing the resurrected Christ and trying.
I mean, that's the crux of it.
Yeah.
All it could have been, because of all of this documentation, it could have been easily saying she started the church, but we haven't really ever looked at it that way. But back in the day, had that been brought out, things would look a lot different.
And when Peter had said to Jesus that he believes that he was the Messiah, that was long before the crucifixion and the resurrection. And it's the resurrection that gives the life to the church, not simply the recognition, Peter, that he was the Messiah rather than being Elijah, or one of the other prophets having returned. Yeah. Well,